The first thing I noticed was the quiet. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like something was about to happen, like the air was holding its breath. I sat on the park bench, hands folded in my lap, watching the world move around me. Parents pushed strollers, dogs chased after sticks, teenagers laughed too loudly. Life was happening, but in the middle of it all, there was this stillness. Then, out of nowhere, a voice. Small, uncertain, but clear. Mr. Freeman? I turned my head and saw him. A little boy, maybe 8 or 9, standing just a few feet away. Messy brown hair, thin frame, oversized jacket like it belonged to an older brother. His hands were shoved into his pockets, but I could see them shaking. Behind him, a woman, his mother, I assumed, stood near a tree, watching. She looked nervous, like she wasn't sure if she should step in or let him speak. I gave him a small smile. That's me. The boy took a breath, then asked the question that would change everything. Is the devil real? It wasn't the kind of question you expect from a kid. Not in the middle of a bright, sunny afternoon in a quiet park. Not from someone who should be worrying about homework or playing with friends. But there was something about the way he said it, like he wasn't asking out of curiosity, like he already knew the answer and was just hoping he was wrong. I studied his face. His eyes weren't wide with wonder. They were heavy, like they had seen too much for someone his age. Why do you ask, son? His mouth opened, then closed again. He looked down at his shoes, kicking a small rock on the sidewalk. His mother took a step forward, then stopped herself. I could feel the hesitation, the weight of whatever he was holding in. Finally, he whispered, "Because I think he's after me." Those words sent a chill down my spine. I had met a lot of people in my life, heard a lot of stories, but something about this boy, about the way he said it, made my chest tighten. I didn't react right away. I didn't want to scare him, didn't want to show the concern rising in my throat. Instead, I leaned forward just a little, keeping my voice steady. What makes you think that? The boy swallowed hard. His hands left his pockets and twisted together in front of him. He whispers to me at night. I didn't look away. What does he say? He took another breath. His voice got even quieter. That I'm not good enough. That I don't matter. That my mom doesn't love me. His mother gasped, hand flying to her mouth. I glanced at her. Her face was pale, her eyes wet with unshed tears. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a child's imagination running wild. I turned back to him. And do you believe him? The boy's eyes flickered up to meet mine. There was a war happening in them. A war between what he knew and what he felt. He shook his head, but it wasn't convincing. Not always, he admitted. But sometimes it feels like he's right. I let those words sit in the air for a moment. The wind rustled through the trees. A dog barked in the distance. But the world around us felt separate, like we were in a bubble, trapped in this moment. Finally, I spoke. What's your name? He hesitated, then said, Daniel. Daniel. I repeated, letting the name settle on my tongue. I glanced at his mother. You're his mom? She nodded quickly. Yes. I'm Rachel. Her voice was tight, like she was barely holding it together. I don't know where this is coming from. He's always been such a happy kid, but lately, he's been so different. I looked back at Daniel. He was biting his lip, eyes fixed on the ground. I sighed. Daniel, I need you to listen to me. He lifted his head, just enough to look at me. The devil's greatest trick isn't showing up in the shadows or scaring people in their dreams. I said, it's making you believe he's real in here. I tapped my chest. Because if you believe him, then he doesn't have to do anything else. You'll do the rest for him. Daniel's fingers tightened together. But what if he is real? His voice wavered. What if he is coming for me? His mother let out a shaky breath. Daniel, sweetheart. He took a step back, shaking his head. No, Mom. You don't hear him like I do. He knows things. His voice broke. He shut his eyes tight, like he was trying to block something out. He's in my head. Rachel reached for him, but I lifted a hand to stop her. Not yet. I kept my voice calm, steady. Daniel, I want you to listen to me very carefully. He didn't open his eyes, but he nodded. The devil only whispers to the ones who scare him. Daniel's eyes snapped open. His whole body stilled. Even his mother looked at me, startled. I smiled softly. He wouldn't waste his time on you if you weren't important. Daniel swallowed hard. Important? I nodded. He only goes after the ones who have something powerful inside them, the ones who are strong enough to fight back. Daniel's breath hitched. His small hands trembled. But what if I'm not strong? My smile didn't fade. You already are. He shook his head. No, I'm not. If I was, he wouldn't still be there. He wouldn't still be whispering. I sighed, glancing at his mother again. Her hands were clasped together like she was praying. I turned back to Daniel. Let me ask you something. When he whispers, does he ever win? Daniel blinked. What? When he tells you you're not good enough, do you listen? Daniel hesitated. Sometimes. But do you believe him? His face twisted. I don't know. I tilted my head. Well, you're here, aren't you? You're still standing, still fighting. That means he hasn't won. Daniel's lips parted slightly. He looked down at his hands, as if realizing for the first time that they were still there, still moving. His mother let out a small, choked sound. Daniel looked up at me, his expression unreadable. Then why does he keep trying? I held his gaze. Because you haven't given up. He didn't respond right away. He just stood there breathing, thinking. Then ever so slowly his fingers uncurled. His mother took a shaky step forward. Daniel, sweetheart. He turned toward her, eyes glistening. Do you believe me? I asked softly. Daniel looked at his mother, then back at me. He swallowed, then nodded. Just once. I smiled. Then he's already losing. Daniel took a deep breath, and for the first time since he had walked up to me, his shoulders didn't look so heavy. But then, just as quickly as the moment settled, a shadow crossed his face. His small hands curled into fists again. But what if the wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves overhead? The sun was still shining, but somehow everything felt colder. I watched Daniel closely. His hands were no longer shaking, but there was something in his eyes, something deeper than just fear. His mother, Rachel, took another step closer, as if she was afraid he might slip away if she didn't. Sweetheart, you know I love you, don't you? Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked down at his shoes, scraping the toe of one against the sidewalk. I know you say it. Rachel's face crumpled for a moment before she quickly wiped her cheek and crouched beside him. Daniel, honey, I don't just say it. I mean it. Every single time. I stayed quiet, letting them have the moment. But Daniel wasn't looking at her. His eyes flickered toward me instead, like he was waiting for something more. I sighed. Daniel, what makes you think love might not be enough? His fingers twisted together. He hesitated, then mumbled, because when he talks, it feels more real than when you do. Rachel let out a sharp breath. Daniel. He turned to her, eyes wet but angry. I know you love me, Mom, but when I hear him, I can't feel it. I try, but I can't. His voice cracked, and I don't know why. Rachel covered her mouth, shoulders shaking. I could see the battle happening inside her, wanting to fix it, to make it better, but not knowing how. I looked at Daniel, my voice even. What does he sound like? Daniel blinked at me. What? You said he whispers. But whose voice is it? Daniel frowned. It's like mine, but not really. He shook his head. It's deeper and colder, like it already knows what I'm scared of before I do. Rachel reached for his hand. Daniel, honey, I promise you it's not real. It's just your thoughts. Daniel pulled away. Then why do I hear it, even when I don't want to? I leaned forward. Because fear doesn't wait for permission. Daniel looked at me, his face tight. Then how'd I make it stop? I didn't answer right away. I let the question settle. I could feel Rachel's eyes on me, waiting for me to say the thing that would fix this. But there wasn't one simple answer. Finally, I said, Daniel, when does he whisper the loudest? Daniel shifted on his feet, biting the inside of his cheek. At night, he finally admitted. I nodded. When the lights are off. He nodded back. When you're alone? Another nod. I sighed. Because that's when the world is quiet. And when the world is quiet, our fears get louder. Daniel swallowed hard. But it's not just then. He hesitated, looking away. Sometimes it happens when I'm around people. Even Mom. She'll be right there talking to me, but it's like I can't hear her. I just hear him. Rachel wiped her face quickly. Baby, why didn't you tell me? I didn't want to make you sad. She let out a quiet sob and pulled him into a hug. This time, he didn't pull away. But even as she held him, I could see it in his face. He didn't believe it was over. I gave him a moment before speaking again. Daniel, I want to tell you something I need you to understand. He looked up at me. I held his gaze. You're not broken. Daniel flinched slightly, like he hadn't realized that was even a question he had. You're not weak, and you're not alone. I glanced at Rachel before looking back at him. The devil wants you to feel that way because when you do, you forget how strong you are. And the moment you start believing him, that's when he wins. Daniel's fingers gripped his mother's sleeve. But what if he never goes away? I took a slow breath. Then you keep fighting. He swallowed, voice barely above a whisper. I'm tired of fighting. Rachel held him tighter. Oh, baby, I softened my voice. I know, son. I know. I leaned forward. But do you know what the devil doesn't expect? Daniel wiped his nose and shook his head. I smiled slightly. That you'll keep going anyway. He blinked. He expects you to give up. He expects you to believe him. But every time you wake up, every time you smile, every time you let your mother hold you, you're proving him wrong. Daniel looked at his mom, his face torn between belief and doubt. Then why do I still hear him? I nodded slowly. Because fear doesn't disappear just because we want it to. But do you know what happens when you stop listening to it? Daniel hesitated. It gets quieter. He stared at me, as if trying to decide if that could really be true. Rachel ran a hand through his hair. Honey, you are not alone in this. We'll get through it together. Daniel looked down at his hands. But what if it's not enough? I exhaled. Then you remind him why you're still standing. Daniel's lips parted slightly. He looked up at me, then at his mother. For the first time, there was something new in his eyes. Something stronger than fear. Hope. But just as quickly as it appeared, his shoulders tensed again. His hands balled into fists. Then why does it feel like he's still watching me? The air felt different now, heavier. Daniel's last words hung between us like something we couldn't see, but could feel pressing against our skin. His mother, Rachel, shifted beside him, gripping his hand tightly, but I could tell it wasn't enough to make him feel safe. Still watching you? I repeated, keeping my voice steady. Daniel nodded once, his fingers twitching like he wanted to grab onto something, but wasn't sure what. I don't just hear him, he whispered. Sometimes, I feel him. Rachel let out a shaky breath. Daniel, baby, what do you mean? Daniel swallowed hard, eyes darting around like he expected something to jump out of the shadows. Like he's behind me, or next to me. Sometimes I'll be in my room, and I swear I see something move in the corner, but when I look, it's gone. His voice got quieter, but I know it was there. I didn't react right away. I could feel Rachel's panic rising, the way her grip on him tightened. But Daniel wasn't looking for someone to tell him. He was imagining things. He was looking for something real. I took a slow breath. Daniel, do you ever feel him when you're not afraid? Daniel's brows pulled together. What? When you're happy, when you're laughing, when you're with your mom and you feel safe. Do you ever feel him then? Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. No. I nodded. That's because fear is his only power. And the moment you stop feeding it, he gets weaker. Rachel blinked quickly, trying to process my words, but Daniel's face stayed unsure. But what if he's real? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. What if I'm not just imagining it? I studied him for a moment. Then you have to ask yourself something, Daniel. If he is real, why is he so afraid of you? Daniel's lips parted slightly. Afraid of me? Rachel let out a soft, broken sound, like she was holding back tears. Morgan, please. I just need to know my son is okay. I turned to her. Rachel, your son is stronger than you realize. She covered her mouth, nodding quickly, but I could see it in her eyes. She wanted to believe me, but part of her was still scared. Daniel wasn't looking at his mom anymore. He was staring at me, waiting, needing more. I leaned forward slightly. Daniel, the devil, whatever form he takes, only has power if you give it to him. He feeds on doubt, on fear, on loneliness. That's why you hear him the loudest when you're alone, when it's dark, when you're tired. Because that's when you're at your weakest. Daniel's breath hitched. So what do I do? I exhaled slowly. You remind him who you are. His brows furrowed. Who I am. I nodded. You're not weak. You're not broken. You are here, and you are not alone. Daniel looked down, his hands shaking again. But it feels real, he mumbled. It feels real every time. Rachel cupped his face gently. Baby, listen to me. I will never let anything happen to you. Do you hear me? Daniel's lower lip trembled. But what if you can't stop him? Rachel's voice broke. I will. I promise you, I will. I'll let the words settle before speaking again. Daniel, do you believe you have power? His eyes flickered up to me. What do you mean? I gestured toward him. I mean you. Your voice. Your heart. Your love for your mom. Do you believe those things are stronger than the fear? Daniel didn't answer right away. He glanced at his mother, at her tear-streaked face, then back at me. I don't know, he admitted. I nodded. That's okay, because you don't have to believe it all at once. You just have to take the first step. Daniel took a shaky breath. And what's that? I smiled softly. Stop listening. His brows pulled together. But, no, I said gently, cutting him off. The moment he starts whispering, you do something else. You hum a song. You pray. You talk to your mom. You remind yourself that he only has power if you let him have it. Daniel swallowed hard. And if that doesn't work? I met his gaze. Then you tell him to leave. Rachel sucked in a sharp breath. Morgan, I turned to her. He has more strength in him than he knows, Rachel. He just needs to use it. She nodded quickly, wiping her face. Daniel hesitated, then whispered, What if he doesn't leave? Then you keep telling him, again and again, until he does. Daniel took another breath, deep and shaky. His hands uncurled. His shoulders relaxed just slightly. I smiled. He's afraid of you, Daniel, because you haven't given up. Daniel blinked rapidly, like he was still trying to process it all. And then, for the first time, I saw it, the smallest flicker of something behind his fear. Courage. But just as the moment settled, something shifted in his expression. His breath hitched. His fingers twitched. And then, in the smallest voice, he whispered, Then why do I feel him right now? Daniel's whisper cut through the air like ice. His breath came quicker, his fingers digging into his mother's sleeve. Rachel stiffened beside him, her face pale. I held his gaze, my voice steady. Where do you feel him? Daniel swallowed hard. Behind me. Rachel's hand clamped over her mouth. She pulled him closer, wrapping an arm around him protectively. Morgan, please. Her voice was barely a breath. I didn't break eye contact with Daniel. Don't turn around. His breathing hitched. But, look at me. His wide eyes locked onto mine, searching, desperate. His chest rose and fell in fast, uneven breaths. I could see the war happening inside him. The fight between what he knew was real and what his fear was screaming at him to believe. It's not real, Rachel whispered, rocking him slightly, but Daniel's body remained rigid. I let the silence stretch, the weight of the moment pressing down. Then slowly I said, What is he saying to you? Daniel hesitated. His hands clenched. He's not saying anything. Rachel frowned, running a hand through his hair. Then how do you know he's there? Daniel licked his lips, his voice shaking. Because I feel him waiting. Rachel sucked in a breath. I could feel her fear, but I couldn't let it take over. Daniel, I said softly, why do you think he's waiting? Daniel's face twisted, his whole body trembling now. I don't know. I leaned forward. Yes, you do. His breath shuddered out of him. Because he wants me to be scared. I nodded. And what happens if you're not? Daniel's hands loosened slightly. Rachel looked at me, tears slipping down her face. Morgan, what do we do? I turned back to Daniel. Close your eyes. Daniel's eyes widened. No. Do you trust me? His breathing was uneven, his fingers twitching. He hesitated. Then barely he nodded. Then close your eyes. Rachel let out a shaky breath, holding him tighter. Slowly, Daniel's eyelids fluttered shut. His body was stiff, like he was bracing for something. Now breathe, I instructed. And out. His chest rose and fell, shaky but trying. Good. Now tell me what you see. Daniel swallowed. Nothing. Are you sure? His brows furrowed, eyes still shut. His fingers flexed. It's dark. Is he there? Daniel's jaw tightened. I don't know. Look closer. His breathing picked up again. His lips parted slightly. I think so. I stayed calm. And what is he doing? Daniel's throat bobbed. Still waiting. I'll let the silence settle before speaking again. Ask him why. Rachel let out a small, broken sound, but I placed a hand up, stopping her. Daniel's breath came in sharp, uneven pulls. I don't want to. Then I'll ask for you, I said gently. Why is he waiting? Daniel's brow pinched together like he was listening for something. Then, slowly his face changed. Confusion flickered in his features. I leaned in. What? His lips parted. He's scared. Rachel's breath caught. What? Daniel's hands unclenched slightly, his whole body shifting like something was changing inside him. He's scared of me. I nodded. Good. Now tell him to leave. Daniel's fingers twitched. His face remained tight. What if he doesn't? Then say it again. Daniel's throat bobbed. His lips moved, barely a whisper. Leave. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows slightly. Rachel tensed. Again, I said. Daniel took a breath, his voice stronger. Leave. A long, heavy silence followed. Then, slowly, his shoulders relaxed. His hands loosened. Rachel was holding her breath. Daniel. Daniel opened his eyes. His lips were parted, his face stunned. Rachel shook him slightly. Baby. He blinked. Then, in the smallest voice, he whispered, he's gone. Rachel let out a choked sob, crushing him against her. Oh my God, Daniel. I watched him closely. He wasn't shaking anymore. His breathing had evened out. He looked lighter. Rachel kissed the side of his head over and over. Oh, baby, my baby. Daniel swallowed hard, glancing at me. Why did that work? I smiled softly. Because fear only has power when you let it stay. Daniel let out a slow breath. Will he come back? I didn't lie to him. Maybe. But now you know how to fight him. Daniel bit his lip, thinking. His small hands curled into fists, but not in fear. In strength. Rachel wiped her face, still holding on to him like she might lose him if she let go. Morgan, I don't know how to thank you. I shook my head. You don't have to. Daniel's eyes met mine. So if he comes back, I just tell him to leave. I nodded. And if he doesn't listen, you tell him again. And again. Until he does. Daniel took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. Okay. Rachel sniffled, kissing his forehead. You're so strong, baby. So strong. Daniel's lips twitched slightly, the smallest smile breaking through. I didn't feel strong before. I placed a hand on his shoulder. That's because real strength isn't about how you feel. It's about what you do. Daniel held my gaze, something different in his eyes now. Something stronger than fear. Something unbreakable. Rachel kissed the top of his head one last time. Come on, sweetheart. Let's go home. Daniel nodded, standing up with her. But before they walked away, he turned back to me. Thank you, he said softly. I smiled. No, son. Thank you. And with that, he took his mother's hand and left his fear behind. It had been a few days since I last saw Daniel. Rachel had texted me once, saying he'd been sleeping better, but I could still feel the weight of our last conversation. I knew what had happened wasn't the end of it. It never was. Fear doesn't leave just because you tell it to. It waits. It watches. It looks for the moment when you're not sure anymore. And for Daniel, that moment came sooner than I hoped. The knock on my door was sharp, hurried. I knew before I even opened it who it was. Rachel stood there, breathing hard, her hair a mess like she had rushed out of the house without thinking. And beside her, gripping her hand, was Daniel. But something was wrong. His face was pale, eyes wide, not just afraid but shaken. I stepped aside without a word, letting them in. Rachel barely waited for the door to close before speaking. It happened again, she said, voice tight. I turned to Daniel. Tell me. His fingers curled into his shirt. I did what you said, he whispered. I told him to leave. I told him over and over, but his voice wavered. It didn't work this time. Rachel's grip on his hand tightened. He woke up screaming. Morgan said it was worse than before. I studied Daniel carefully. What was worse? He swallowed. The dream. I didn't rush him. Tell me about it. Daniel hesitated. His eyes flickered to his mom, then back to me. I was in my bed, but when I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my room anymore. Everything looked the same, but it felt different. The air was heavy, like something was pressing on me. I tried to move, but I couldn't. Rachel sucked in a breath, her hand over her mouth. Daniel's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Then I heard him, but this time, he wasn't behind me. He was right next to my bed, breathing, A chill ran through me, but I didn't let it show. Did he say anything? Daniel nodded slowly. He laughed, and then he said, "You think words can make me leave?" Rachel shut her eyes tightly, like she was trying not to break down. I exhaled slowly. "And what did you do?" Daniel's small hands curled into fists. I tried to say it again, to tell him to leave, but my voice wouldn't come out. His breath hitched. It was like he took it from me. Rachel let out a shaky breath. "Morgan, what is happening to my son?" I crouched in front of Daniel, so we were eye level. "He made you doubt yourself, didn't he?" Daniel nodded, his face tense. "I tried so hard, but I wasn't strong enough." I shook my head. "That's not true." Daniel frowned. "But I couldn't make him leave." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Because he wasn't testing your strength, Daniel. He was testing your belief in it." Rachel stared at me. "I don't understand." I kept my focus on Daniel. "He saw that you were getting stronger, so he pushed harder. He wanted you to question everything we talked about. He wanted to make you feel powerless." Daniel's face twisted. "But I was powerless." "No," I said firmly. "You just forgot that he only wins if you believe him." Daniel blinked rapidly, his lip trembling. "Then what do I do?" "You do the hardest thing," I said. "You believe even when it feels like you shouldn't." Daniel's breath hitched. "What if I can't?" "You can." His hands tightened into fists. "But what if he comes back again?" I nodded. "He will." Rachel's body tensed. "Morgan." I turned to her. "Rachel, he's already fought once and won. This is just another fight." Rachel wiped at her eyes, struggling to hold herself together. "I don't want him to have to fight at all." I softened. "I know." She sucked in a sharp breath, nodding quickly, but I could see the helplessness in her eyes. Daniel looked down at his lap, thinking. The silence stretched between us. And then, in the smallest voice, he said, "I don't want to be afraid anymore." I smiled softly. "Then don't be." Daniel looked up at me, his eyes still unsure. "But what if I am?" "Then you keep standing." Daniel took a deep breath, like he was trying to absorb every word. Rachel pulled him close, kissing the top of his head. "I love you, baby. So much." Daniel melted into her arms, his small fingers gripping her tightly. "I love you too, Mom." I stood, watching the two of them, and I knew something had shifted. The fear was still there, but this time it didn't feel like it was winning. Daniel pulled back slightly and looked at me. "What if I see him again tonight?" I met his gaze. "Then you know what to do." Daniel nodded slowly. Rachel wiped her face, standing up. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go home." Daniel turned to follow her, but stopped at the door. He looked back at me, his small frame still, his expression unreadable. And then, after a long pause, he said, "I think I understand now." I tilted my head. "Understand what?" Daniel swallowed hard. He wasn't testing my strength. I nodded, waiting. He was testing my faith in it. A slow smile spread across my face. "That's right." Daniel nodded to himself, then turned and walked out the door. And this time, he didn't look back. It had been a couple of weeks since Daniel had confronted his fear, and I could tell that something had changed in him. It wasn't just the way he held himself or the way he spoke. It was the quiet strength that seemed to surround him now. Rachel had told me that he wasn't having nightmares anymore, and his days were filled with a new kind of peace. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not really. I was sitting on the porch one evening, the sun beginning to set, casting long shadows over the yard. It was one of those moments where the world felt still, and you could hear the soft rustling of the leaves, the chirp of crickets. Daniel came out, his small feet quiet against the wooden floor. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside me, staring out at the horizon. I watched him for a moment, waiting. Finally, he spoke. "Morgan." I turned to look at him. "Yeah." Daniel hesitated, his fingers playing with the hem of his shirt. "I've been thinking about something." I nodded. "What is it?" He looked up at me, his eyes full of something I couldn't quite place. "When you told me to believe in my strength, I thought that meant I had to be strong all the time. Like not be scared ever." I felt a small smile tug at the corner of my lips. "And now?" Daniel bit his lip, thinking, "Now I think it means something else." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts. "I think it means that sometimes you're not supposed to be strong. Sometimes it's okay to be scared." I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence settle for a moment. You're right. He looked up at me, surprise flickering across his face. But you told me. I nodded. I know what I told you, Daniel. But the thing is, fear doesn't always go away. It doesn't disappear because we wish it would. Sometimes you have to face it. And when you face it, you realize something important. He frowned, confused. What? You realize that being afraid doesn't mean you're weak, I said slowly. It just means you're human. Daniel's expression softened, his shoulders relaxing. So, I don't have to be strong all the time. No, you don't. I watched him carefully, the look on his face shifting as he processed my words. There was something new in his eyes now, a kind of understanding, but also a question. What's the question, Daniel? He shifted his weight, still looking down at the ground. Then why do we fight it? I took a slow breath, thinking carefully. Because if we don't fight it, we let it control us. Fear can take over if we let it. But if we face it, if we look it in the eye, even when we're scared, it loses its power. Daniel looked at me, as if searching for something in my face. So, if we're not supposed to be strong all the time, how do we know when to fight? I smiled softly, leaning forward. That's the tricky part, isn't it? Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he just sat there, his small face deep in thought. The air around us seemed to grow heavier, like there was more to this conversation than we were both letting on. And then, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel looked up at me, his voice barely above a whisper. I think I know what you mean. I waited. He took a breath, his fingers still fidgeting with his shirt. I've been thinking a lot about the devil, about what he really is. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't let it show. What have you been thinking? Daniel swallowed hard. I think he's not just a guy with horns. I think he's fear. Fear of everything. Of not being good enough. Of losing people. Of being alone. And when we're scared, we believe that he's real. I didn't interrupt. I just let him speak. But if we believe in him, Daniel continued, then we make him real. He's not real unless we let him be. I nodded slowly. That's exactly right. He looked at me, his eyes wide, almost like he was waiting for me to confirm something. So, it's not about fighting him, is it? I let out a soft breath. No, it's not. Daniel's face lit up like a light bulb had gone off inside his head. It's about not believing in him at all, isn't it? I smiled. Yes, Daniel. It's about choosing not to believe in the things that scare us, not giving them power. He sat back in his chair, staring at the sky like he was trying to figure out how to hold all of this inside of him. So, the answer isn't to be strong. It's to not let fear make me weak. Exactly. Daniel was quiet for a moment, his small hands resting in his lap. But if fear's still there, what do? I sat back, my eyes never leaving him. You do what you've been doing. You don't let it control you. You face it, but you don't let it decide what happens next. He nodded slowly. So, if I'm scared, it's okay? Yes. It's okay to be scared. And it's okay to ask for help. I nodded again. Always. Daniel's eyes searched mine, as if he was looking for some kind of reassurance. And in that moment, I realized that the battle he was facing wasn't just with the devil or with fear. It was with himself. And he was winning. I'm not perfect, Daniel said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. I get scared sometimes, but I think I can fight it. I leaned forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to be perfect, Daniel. You just have to keep going. Every day, no matter what. His eyes welled up, but he didn't look away. He was stronger now, more confident. I'll keep going, Morgan. I promise. I smiled. I know you will. He stood up slowly, glancing at me before turning toward the door. As he walked away, I sat back in my chair, watching him go. I knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy for him. But I also knew he had something inside of him now, something stronger than fear, something that couldn't be shaken. The answer, I realized, wasn't just about facing fear. It was about believing that you could overcome it. And Daniel had learned that, in his own way. I couldn't have been prouder. The days had passed peacefully, more than I expected, really. I'd watched Daniel's confidence grow, and I thought, for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, the devil was finally done with him. The boy had found a way to stand tall in the face of fear, and I was proud of him. But I should have known better. There's always another layer to the story, another test hiding just around the corner. It was late one evening when Rachel called me. Her voice trembled through the phone, and I could hear the panic in her breath. "Morgan, it's Daniel. He's acting strange." I stood up, my heart tightening. "What's wrong?" "I don't know. He won't talk to me, and he's been locking himself in his room. He says he's fine, but he's not acting like himself." My stomach dropped. "I'll be right there." I didn't even take a second to grab my coat. I just left, moving quickly down the street to Rachel's house. The sky had turned dark, a heavy blanket of clouds stretching overhead. There was a strange stillness in the air, like the world was holding its breath. When I arrived, Rachel was standing outside, pacing. Her eyes were wide with worry, and her hand was wringing a towel she didn't even realize she was holding. I didn't say anything at first. I just walked inside, listening for any sign of Daniel. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. "Daniel?" I called softly as I walked down the hallway. There was no answer. I reached his door and knocked lightly, not wanting to startle him. "Daniel, it's me. Can I come in?" Still no response. Rachel stood in the doorway behind me, wringing her hands. "He hasn't said a word all evening. I'm starting to get really worried, Morgan." I turned to her, my face serious. "He's been through a lot. Sometimes silence is his way of dealing with it. Let me talk to him." Rachel nodded, but didn't move. She was clearly concerned. I took a deep breath and slowly opened the door. Daniel was sitting on his bed, his back to me. His shoulders were hunched, and his head was lowered, like he was deep in thought, or perhaps something else. "Daniel," I said again, my voice gentle. He didn't turn around. I took a step closer. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" Finally, he turned his head just enough to look at me, but his eyes were empty. Hollow. Something inside me tensed. This wasn't the same boy I had talked to a few days ago. "I'm fine," he said, but the words were flat. Robotic almost. I crouched down in front of him, trying to meet his eyes. "You sure about that?" He nodded slowly, his hands twisting nervously in his lap. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "Daniel, if something's bothering you, you can tell me. You don't have to keep it inside." He didn't respond, and for a moment, I thought he might stay silent forever. But then, just when I thought I couldn't stand the quiet any longer, he spoke. "I see him again, Morgan." The words hit me like a cold wave. "Who do you see?" Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "The devil." My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't possible. I thought we were past this. He was stronger than this. He had to be. "You're sure?" I asked, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. "Are you sure it's really him?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I can feel him. He's here, right behind me, watching me, waiting." I placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer comfort. "Daniel, listen to me. You've already faced him. You've already told him to leave." "I know," he said, his voice trembling. "But this time, it's different. He's stronger." A chill ran through me. "What do you mean stronger?" Daniel's eyes flickered with fear, but he refused to look at me directly. "He knows things I didn't tell anyone. Things only I know." The air seemed to grow heavier, like the room itself was closing in around us. "Like what?" Daniel swallowed hard, his hands clenched into fists. He said that I wasn't strong enough, that I'd never be strong enough, that I would always fail. I felt a knot form in my chest. This wasn't the same devil we'd talked about before, the one we could face and defeat with strength and belief. This one was different. This one was playing a deeper game. "Daniel," I said softly, "this is just another trick. He's trying to make you doubt yourself again. But you know better now. You're stronger than he is." Daniel shook his head. "No, Morgan. He's not just talking anymore. He's showing me things." I felt a cold shiver creep up my spine. "What kind of things?" "He shows me what I'm afraid of," Daniel whispered. "He shows me the things I wish I'd never seen. The things that hurt the most." I squeezed his shoulder gently. "Daniel, you've already faced those things. You're not alone in this. You don't have to fight him alone." Daniel looked at me, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't name. Fear, confusion, but also something else. Something darker. "What if I can't do it, Morgan?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What if I can't win?" I stood up, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I needed to do something. Anything. But what? How could I fight something that was inside Daniel's head? How could I fight something that wasn't just in the world around us, but in his very mind? Daniel, I said, my voice steady despite the fear creeping up on me. We've talked about this before. You are stronger than you think. Don't listen to him. Don't believe the lies he's telling you. You have the power to make him leave. Daniel stared at me, his small body trembling. The door creaked open behind me, and Rachel stepped into the room, her eyes wide with concern. She had heard everything, and she was terrified. Daniel, honey, she said softly, we've been through this together. We're not going to let him win. But Daniel didn't seem to hear her. He just stared at me, like he was waiting for the truth to come, waiting for me to give him the answer. And then, in the darkest part of my mind, a horrible thought flickered. What if it wasn't just fear that was tormenting him? What if the devil wasn't just a trick? What if he had found a way to latch onto something deeper, something more permanent? What if he really can't win this time? Daniel asked, his voice breaking. I froze. What was happening to him? What had changed? I glanced at Rachel, whose face was now pale with worry. We both knew something had shifted. We didn't know how or why, but we knew that the devil was still playing his games. And this time, the air felt heavy in the house. I could sense the weight of what was happening, the battle between Daniel and something far darker than anything I had ever imagined. As I stood in that room, with Rachel standing behind me, I couldn't help but wonder if we had waited too long. Had the devil's grip on Daniel grown too strong? Had we done enough to help him fight back? But then, I looked at Daniel. He was sitting on his bed again, his eyes glassy and distant, like he wasn't fully there. His small hands were curled into fists, but there was no anger, only fear. He had been through so much, and yet I knew deep down he hadn't lost his strength. Not entirely. I knew we had to act, and we had to act now. Daniel, I said softly, my voice steady but full of urgency. Listen to me, buddy. You don't have to fight this alone. We're here. You're not alone. I'm with you. Rachel's with you. And we're all fighting this with you. For a moment, there was no answer. The silence was suffocating, but I wasn't about to give up on him now. Daniel's voice came, a thin whisper. But what if he's stronger than me? What if I can't do it? I knelt down in front of him, trying to meet his eyes. Daniel, you're stronger than you think. The devil may try to make you doubt yourself, but you know the truth. You've faced fear before, and you've overcome it. He shook his head. But this time is different, Morgan. This time, it feels like he's inside my head. He knows everything. He knows all the things I'm afraid of, all the things I wish I could forget. I took a deep breath. This was it, the moment we had been building up to. Daniel, the devil can't take away your strength. He can't make you afraid unless you let him. He can show you things, make you feel things, but you control what you believe. Not him. I could see the doubt still lingering in Daniel's eyes, but I refused to back down. This was the moment we had to make him see it. I know you're scared, Daniel. That's okay. It's okay to be afraid. But you don't have to let that fear control you. He stared at me, his small face a mixture of confusion and fear. And that's when I saw it, the first crack in the armor. You've been fighting the wrong thing, Daniel, I said, my voice low and firm. You've been fighting the fear, thinking that's the battle. But the real battle is about something else. The real battle is about you believing in yourself. The devil wants you to doubt yourself. He wants you to think you're weak, that you can't do it. But you know the truth. Daniel's eyes flickered, just for a moment, as if he was beginning to understand. The devil can't take away what's inside you, I said softly. Your strength comes from the belief that you can stand tall, even when you're afraid. It comes from knowing that no matter how hard it gets, you can rise above it. I saw his hands relax just slightly. A small shift, but it was something. Daniel, Rachel's voice broke through, gentle but full of love. We're so proud of you. You've been so brave. And you're not alone in this. We're right here with you. You can beat this. You have the power to choose your own path. I could see the struggle in his face, the inner battle playing out right in front of us. But for the first time in days, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a spark of hope. I'm scared, Daniel said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can do it. I placed a hand on his shoulder, offering him the comfort he needed. It's okay to be scared, Daniel. The fear is never going to go away completely. But that doesn't mean it has to control you. The choice is yours. You have the power to choose to face it, to keep going even when it feels impossible. He looked down, his eyes searching for something inside himself. But what if I fail? I smiled, my heart swelling with pride. Failure isn't the opposite of success, Daniel. It's just part of the journey. Everyone gets scared. Everyone stumbles. But the real victory isn't getting back up. It's in the courage to try again. Daniel took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly. For the first time in what felt like forever, I saw him start to breathe a little easier. Do you believe in yourself, Daniel? I asked, my voice soft but firm. He hesitated for a long moment, the weight of the question heavy in the room. But then, slowly, he nodded. I think I do. And that was the moment. That was the shift. The devil had lost his grip, and Daniel had found his strength once again. The air in the room seemed to change. The heaviness lifted, replaced with a sense of lightness and peace. The darkness that had been looming over him began to recede, and I could almost feel the devil's presence fade into nothingness. Daniel stood up, his small body still trembling, but his posture was different. He was no longer slouched in fear. He stood tall, a quiet strength radiating from him. He had done it. He had faced his fear, and he had overcome it. I did it, didn't I? He asked, his voice small but full of wonder. I smiled, my heart full. Yes, you did. You're stronger than you think, Daniel. And you don't have to be afraid anymore. Rachel stepped forward, her eyes filled with tears. She pulled him into a tight hug, holding him close. I'm so proud of you, Daniel. You're so brave. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about Daniel overcoming his fear of the devil. It was about him discovering something much deeper. It was about him learning that no matter how hard life gets, no matter how many fears or doubts try to pull him down, he has the strength to rise above it. He had won the battle, not just against the devil, but against everything that ever made him feel small, weak, or afraid. As I stood there, watching them embrace, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over me. Daniel had found the courage to believe in himself. He had found the strength to face the hardest part of life, his own fears, and he had won. And that, I realized, was the real victory. The devil had no power here. Not anymore. Thank you for listening to another exciting story from VIP Vault. If you have enjoyed listening to this story, check out our videos here.